Marc Eichenbaum is the Special Assistant to the Mayor for Homeless Initiatives for the City of Houston. Marc, it's really good to be here.
Thank you. Welcome to Houston.
Yeah, thank you. We're liking it. I mean, this is maybe the best weather of the year.
Welcome to March in Houston. Don't stick around for a couple more weeks or it's going to be another story.
I imagine a lot of people have moved here in March and they've got a little bit of a little different weather later.
You're right about that.
Yeah, I could move here right now. We love it. Houston, I'm just glad to be here. Every graph for homelessness across the country that I've been seeing looks like this. And you guys, you're down 53% over 10 years?
Closer to 60% now.
Wow. Lowest per capita homeless population in the nation of any major city.
Didn't used to always be like that. We used to have the sixth largest population of individuals experiencing homelessness in the country.
You're in trouble with HUD.
You're right. We were named a priority community by HUD, which is not a good designation.
Right.
We had, on any given night, over 8,500 individuals sleeping on our streets and in our shelters.
What's that number today?
Now it's around 3,000.
Far less than half.
Far less than half. And but not only do we have to do big things to get there, we have to continue to keep that momentum, or else we will regress. I think there's tens of thousands of people throughout our city, throughout our state and country that are experiencing housing instability every day. And those individuals are falling into homelessness. And we have to get more folks out of homelessness than become homeless to get a net reduction. And that's the big challenge that Houston struggled with, and we still struggle with it today. And it's what every other city in the country deals with.
And because there's so many perceptions around homelessness, the perception possibly is Houston's doing a good job with homelessness, and that word gets out, and suddenly people are moving from outside the area into Houston. But I think you've told me that that's not actually, people are dropping into homelessness, but they're not people coming from outside the area.
That was a concern before we even started our coordinated collaborative system. Folks said, you're going to house people with services and with no strings attached. People are going to flood into Houston. And the reality is it's just not true. Once again, we always go back to the data. And we always have these concerns or preconceptions or theories, but we always go back to the data. And the data shows the vast majority of folks are from Southeast Texas that are experiencing homelessness in Houston. And the percentage has not changed over time.
So you're dealing with your own population.
We're dealing with our own population.
Wow. And when we talk about housing as a solution, and I think, just talking about maybe perceptions and some misperceptions, I've heard, if you drop somebody into housing and you don't give them the support they need, they're going to fail. But first of all, I think you told me 2 years later, if you put somebody in housing in your program, various programs, 2 years later?
We're at 90% success rate, around a 10% recidivism rate. When you look at permanent supportive housing itself, it's about 80% success rate nationwide, and we're right there at 90%. I think when we started, there was preconceptions. Folks would say, "Man, these folks, they're really, really vulnerable, and they have some really difficult backgrounds. We drive by them, we see them. There's no way we can house them. There's no way they would stay housed. They need to be fixed." They need to be reformed. They need to be taught how to live before we can house them. And at the same time, we realize the data shows, once again, whenever we have these questions, we go to the data. The data shows it's not true. That these folks, we are moving folks who have been living on the streets for years, living in encampments for years, right into housing. And those folks, not 100%, you can always find some exceptions, but the data shows the vast majority of them are staying stably housed for the long term.
But I'm also hearing, as you're navigating them into housing, and I think you just hired or paid for, you and the county, the city and the county, paid for 9 navigators over at the Beacon, and using ARPA dollars, federal dollars, and CARES dollars perhaps before that. But you're connecting them to services. You're not just dropping them into housing. There's a whole wraparound system, getting them IDs, the whole process. Maybe you could just talk about that. What is
the process? And it's a shame. So often, the word housing gets used exclusively, just that term.
Right.
But the reality is it's housing with wraparound, tailored support services. It would be negligent to house an individual experiencing homelessness without services. The services is what keeps the person housed, and the housing is what makes the services effective. So, I mean, it is both. So when we say housing, when we say supportive housing, what we're talking about is low barrier housing with support services.
Right.
And not everybody gets long-term housing. The housing intervention is tailored to that individual specific
They're
situation.
all
and
different.
need.
These aren't widgets.
You're
These
exactly
are
right.
people.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. So, you know, we immediately put the person into housing, and there's folks out there that feel that some people aren't deserving of housing. The reality is the alternative is that they're still on our streets.
Yeah.
And we can go back and we can have housing with some, you know, common sense rules and requirements and requests. It makes sense. But the reality is that's what we've been doing for decades. And that's one reason why we still have so many people on our streets. So low barrier housing with support services is the key. Both of those combined, one without the other won't work.
And even the navigation process as it begins, it's low barrier.
You're right.
Maybe you just say why.
You're right. You know, if somebody has been spending a long time on the streets, and the first thing you do is put a bunch of rules and requirements, it's likely the person will say, Psh, I'll go back out onto the streets. I understand. I would do the same if I was in that situation. And so the reality is, and they're used to it. They're used to being promised the world. I got this for you. I got that for you. But only for those dreams and those promises to be cut short. Why? Because folks weren't willing to deal with folks who, or were experienced with folks who are challenging or difficult. Or folks wanted to have a very paternalistic set of criteria and rules that folks abide by. And if not, they're not worthy of the housing. The reality is let's just get them off the streets. We are not a system that is here to just fix all poverty. We are not a system here to reform folks and fix folks. We're a system to get folks off the streets and out of the shelters.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very human element in all this, and you're addressing a lot of that, but you keep going back to the data, and you're also kind of a financial guy. I mean, when you say that we're moving them into housing, you're saying we're not generally using shelters. It's low barrier, but there's a financial argument behind all this.
Yeah, you know, let me tell you, the folks that sit around the dais at City Council or at the County Court of Commissioners, they're Republicans and they're Democrats. But we have, what's unique here is that no matter party affiliation, people have come together to say this is an issue, we're going to make it a priority, and we're going to focus wherever we're going to get the biggest rate of return. We are running this like a business. We have limited dollars here. We spend no local governmental dollars from the city on homelessness. So with limited resources, we owe it to the taxpayers and we owe it to our homeless clients themselves to invest those funds wherever we're going to get the biggest rate of return on.
And I think maybe that's one of the, if you're looking at it from the outside and you see these encampments and things, you think, man, this is going to financially overwhelm the system.
Yeah.
Like we can't help. But you alluded to almost an alignment of the stars in terms of funding and maybe this opportunity that we have at this point in time, because Spokane's not where you guys are.
Well, you know, Spokane is where we were 12 years ago.
Right.
And so there's more than hope for everybody. It really takes hard work and community will and political will. And I think those ingredients are coming together in Spokane. What we realized is, looking at every study that's been done by all the cities out there, is that having folks on our streets is costing us a lot of money. It is actually financially conservative to put folks into housing with wraparound support services than it is to have them on our streets.
So it's not, can we afford to do all these things you're talking
You
about?
can't afford
can
not
we
to.
afford not to?
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. So, I mean, it is costing you more money to walk by somebody on the streets of Spokane who's homeless than it is just to put them in housing with wraparound support services. Your number one cost is going to be healthcare, besides cleaning up the streets, besides police responses, fire responses, ambulance responses, jail costs, shelter costs. It ends up being really
it's not
expensive.
just the cost of doing something, it's the cost of not doing something.
Yeah.
And there's a big cost there, and you've kind of broken that down.
Yeah, you know, what we looked at is based on studies done throughout the country, we were able to determine when we started that just our chronically homeless population, you know, that's almost like just 25% of our population to start with, was costing taxpayers over $102 million annually.
To do nothing.
To do nothing. And that is cost in the emergency room, it's cleaning up the streets, it's first responders costs, jail costs, shelter costs. Just to manage the issue is very, very expensive.
Right.
And then we came to a realization that it actually can be fiscally conservative, less expensive to actually take these folks, put them in Class A, great housing with wraparound supportive services.
Yeah, which sounds almost pie in the sky, but again, it's fiscally responsible. This is the most cost-effective way you can deal with this issue.
You're exactly right. And I think the mayor at the time realized we were like a dog chasing its tail. We were spending millions and millions and millions of every year, and all we had was anecdotal stories of success. We weren't really moving the needle at all on reducing homelessness. And that's because all the money we were investing was going to managing the issue. And it came a conscious decision from our political leaders and from the community to go from managing the issue to actually solving it. So now we smartly invest all of our public resources into long-term solutions to the issue, not things and activities that just manage it.
It's a long-term issue.
You're exactly right.
Wow.
Going back to 12 years ago when you guys shifted, talk about how that was a community effort, not just one person or one entity.
And you do not know what it would be per person?
Oh,
Well, I think the county
No,
will.
you don't
I think the
say
county will get into there. Or Mike will say that.
Okay.
And that's even a separate number. So
Great.
once I say it, you'll
I like
even
yours
get in.
a lot.
It'll get even more.
yeah, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
I think
Gavin,
it's something
if
like
you really
100,000.
wanna drop your, we're just kind of branding this. I think this whole
Yeah.
thing as housing with help.
Okay. Great. So I'll drop back in there. Clap.
And I'll mention the county. Even when we started, we were united. Even the dollars from
Yeah,
our
that-
housing
we need to hear
departments
that.
were invested jointly with joint RFPs and a method to the madness.
So the housing first model, which really Houston is, when cities look around and say, who's doing that right? It's Houston. Then we're kind of playing with names because it feels like almost a little bit of a misnomer, and maybe saying something like housing with help or something like
Yeah,
that.
it's exactly what it is. At the end of the day, it's low barrier That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's low barrier housing without all stringent rules and criteria and restrictions that normally may keep individuals experiencing homelessness away. So let's make the open sign as bright as possible, and that's what housing does. That's low barrier. Then once we get them in, then let's voluntarily bring them support services. And folks all the time will say, if it's voluntary, the people aren't going to engage the services. Wrong. Once again, we look at the data, and in Houston, we have a much higher rate of engagement making the services voluntarily than when we forced it upon people. Because people were feeling that they were picking their own destiny, and
Right.
they had some individual choice into the matter. And by and far, most of the folks we house, almost 99%, take us up on the offer of those wraparound supportive services.
So when you offer that complete packages, there's a house at the end of the rainbow. There's these services supporting you going into it. You hear a lot of people don't want to move out of homelessness, but when you offer it that way, over 90%.
Yeah.
Wow.
And there's the same misnomer too. People see the folks on the streets and they say, those folks don't want housing. Those folks can't be housed. But what happens is when we go and we offer shelter to them, barely anybody says yes. But when we go offer housing with wraparound supportive services, once again, 95+% of the folks are saying yes, please. The folks on the streets actually do want housing. And we just don't put them in any regular housing, but housing with holistic, wraparound, therapeutic, whatever you want to call it, support services
Which can
to meet their
kind of
needs.
sound touchy-feely, but it's not. It's data-driven.
Yeah, it's data-driven. And the reason we do that is because that's what keeps the person housed. And at the end of the day, we look at two metrics. How many people are we housing, and how long are they staying housed? It doesn't matter if you house 10,000 folks if 9,000 leave in the first week. And so those are the metrics that we're looking at. And we're looking at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months. And of all of our housing programs, we're looking at the recidivism rates. Which ones are dipping below the average? Can we provide them assistance and help to keep the folks housed? Right. And at the end of the day, it's about getting folks to housing and keeping them housed with those services.
I want to go back to when you began this process. Before I go there, you know a lot about your homeless population. I was looking at the Beacon, and people are walking in for a meal or a cup of coffee, or all the services there, legal services, healthcare services, you name it. But every time they walk through that door, they're getting scanned. And there's a data. We know these individuals. We know where they are, and we understand what their needs are.
Yeah,
that's a little different.
And that's huge. The very first thing is you got to know who your homeless are.
Yeah.
And you got to know who they are, what their issues are, and what are their needs. So, like Spokane and every other jurisdiction, we use the Homeless Management Information System. Folks in the bubble call it HMIS.
Right.
But the reality is not only are organizations receiving government funds using it, but other organizations too. It provides a wealth of information. So now we know who in our homeless population is getting breakfast where are they going for lunch, where are they going for dinner, which ones are going to healthcare for the homeless, how often are they going to healthcare for the homeless, are those people assessed for housing, who's their housing navigator. Everybody can see that same online real-time almost case file on every homeless individual.
That wasn't always the case. So let's go back those 10 or 12 years, roll the time back.
Yeah.
And at that point, not everybody's working together. Not everybody's using the same data sets, et cetera. So what happened then?
So, it's all about creating a method to the madness. And back before we started this, everybody was doing their own thing, their own way, with their own strategies, their own goals, their own interventions.
A lot of good stuff.
A lot of great stuff and well-meaning stuff. But we were working against each other. We were going in opposite directions. And what we realized is that with limited resources and a huge need, we needed to get smarter. So how can we take those same resources, the same work that's being done out there, but get smarter about it? And we're doing that through collaborating. And
where did that leadership come from? I mean, obviously this makes a lot of sense, but the leadership, somehow you got everybody to start talking about this. How did that happen?
So when we started, the mayor at the time, Mayor Annise Parker, said, we're spending millions of dollars.
She's the mayor of the city of Houston.
The city of Houston. We're expecting
strong mayor form of government.
And she's saying we're spending millions of dollars the same way every single year, and we're expecting different results. That's ludicrous.
Einstein's definition of insanity.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
And Mayor Parker had adopted formerly homeless youth, and she said, we got to change how we operate. And she kind of did a big call to action to the community. And she didn't come out with what the answer is. She just said, I'm going to make this a top priority. We all need to make it a top priority. It's a community issue. Every neighborhood in Houston has individuals experiencing homelessness. Every neighborhood needs to be a part of the solution. It's about the public and private partnerships coming together. It's about having the philanthropic and the ecumenical sectors coming together. So Mayor Parker did this big challenge. She said, we need to be smarter. We need to do it differently. We held a 3-day community charrette. Over 400 individuals came out. And from that, we said, hey, we're going to focus on data-driven best practices, and we're going to make a collaborative system. We started with just a pilot of trying
who can't agree on data and collaboration?
You're right. And then the data is where it took us on. And what all the community partners said, when you lay out all the options on the table with all the data, to us at the time it was clear that supportive housing was the answer. Nothing came close to it. We can look at just doing treatment, for instance, or just, but the reality is that the typical individual goes through, detox 7 times. We don't have enough time. The issue's getting worse and worse every single day. We don't have years.
More expensive.
And we don't have the time nor money to do it. So we said, let's focus on that. Based on that, that's when the rest of the community came around. While the mayor is a huge leader, and it can't be done without the mayor. It's not the mayor's plan. It's a community plan. Here we have one plan that the county's part of, the city's part of, the private sector's part of, the homeless response system's part of, that one unified plan. And one of the biggest things was actually the city and county coming together.
Right.
City and county.
Which is tricky. I mean, homelessness is an urban problem. It's a city problem for the most part. And yet a lot of the funding and the statutory mechanisms are housed with the county. So getting those two on the
I
same
think at
page
the very
is pretty
basic level is that the county gets dollars from HUD.
Yeah.
and gets dollars from HUD that can be used on homelessness, and some of it has to be used on homelessness. So at least those HUD dollars that are coming to the city and coming to the county should be invested strategically aligned with each other. And that's what we did to start with. A joint RFP between the city and the county's housing departments to at least align those dollars to maximize the impact of those financial resources. Today, the city and county are step by step equally investing dollars into the issue with equal ownership. And I think folks have realized, you can't make homelessness your third most important issue, your fourth most important issue. You can't make it, the county can't say, hey, it's not our issue because we're worried about the unincorporated areas of the county. Right. The reality is you can only move that needle when everybody comes around and says, we are going to make this a priority issue and we're going to work together.
Wow. So going back to just, we've got encampments on our streets. I think you have something resembling a moratorium on new encampments, but you grandfathered existing.
Yeah, what we're doing is that, the mayor believes strictly that we're not going to tolerate encampments. Encampments are not an answer to homelessness. A tent shouldn't be a home for somebody, a long-term home for somebody. We can do better than that in the city of Houston. And so we're a compassionate city, and we want to take that compassion and direct it to a way of, once again, not managing the issues of encampments, but actually solving it. We were running our police around nonstop, to this encampment, to that encampment, without any results. Now, we are holistically decommissioning encampments through supportive housing.
So when you have an encampment, you want to decommission it. Before you begin that process, maybe just talk. I understand you're using something called navigation centers, a navigation center, and then you also have this housing at the end of that. So maybe just how does that come together?
So same thing with outreach. We had lots of organizations doing outreach. We want to have a method to the madness. So we pull together and let's make it really strategic. So now we have dedicated outreach teams just working to decommission large encampments. Other dedicated outreach teams on small encampments, and a third one dealing with all the scattered individuals experiencing homelessness that aren't necessarily living in encampments.
And back to data, I think you have it all on a map. I mean, you have a map that shows exactly.
Right. The map's fluid, but you still need to have a map. And you got to just make it really strategic. And so, with those teams, we're assessing the folks for housing, spending weeks with those folks developing relationships.
Before you even begin to think about decommission. I mean, you're
right. So they're out there. Every person at the encampments have to start pulling together all the paperwork that's recorded for the housing. We have to go form those relationships. And then comes the magic week. And that week is when it's a surge. Everybody goes there. We have Metro provides buses, and we are transporting the folks directly from the encampment into navigation centers or to be housed or straight into permanent housing.
And what happens when I go from an encampment to a navigation center? What happens there at the navigation center?
At the navigation center is when they are working with their housing navigators. It's a consistent location where their housing navigator can find them to work on all the paperwork and all the requirements to get them placed into permanent housing.
So, and a lot of the supportive services, if I need health care, if we met a gentleman this afternoon that had to get his ID and he had to actually have his name corrected. And all those.
So it happens at the navigation center.
Yeah.
And then when the housing becomes available, the individual gets moved right out of the navigation center into the housing.
But the navigation center, I think you're targeting 90 days or less.
You're right. And the navigation center is a pit stop on the road to being housed. But the navigation center is only as good as there's housing available. Right now, Houston, like so much of America, and especially the West Coast, is having issues with affordable housing and finding enough housing.
How are you dealing with that?
Well, we're looking at unconventional ways. Like so many other cities, we're starting to look at converting motels and hotels, not into shelters, but into permanent housing. Right. We are looking at taking, old warehouses and hospitals and converting that, places that may not have been traditionally looked at as options for housing. Let's look at it. Let's turn it into housing.
You even looked at like tiny houses, but you had a little different take on that?
Yeah, listen, we love tiny houses. Tiny houses believes that to solve homelessness, you have to take that person and put them in a home so they're no longer homeless. Housing is the answer. And we would invest in tiny houses here. But what we believe in Houston, once again, lasered focus on driving impact and driving it quickly. So to bring things to scale, we take tiny homes, we stack them on top of each other, and we call them apartments.
Which is what an apartment is.
We could probably find 50 folks to go move out to the boondocks where we can place the tiny homes. But they're not the most vulnerable that we want to target.
Right.
And so bringing things to scale in a route in a way that's attractive to the most vulnerable individuals you want to target is key.
Wow. You have a temporary nav center now, and you're building a new one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. We're building a new one using a city-owned property.
Yeah.
And it'll increase capacity, and it's purposely designed and built just for this purpose.
Right.
And this will enable us to even decommission even more encampments. But the goal of the navigation center is helping us increase the number of people we're housing and to reduce the amount of time to house them.
Right.
So the navigation center is not designed to be a warehouse to warehouse people in.
Yeah.
It is meant to be just a stepping stone to help enhance our ability to house folks.
So, Mark, there's we heard this morning, 100 agencies working together on this. Everybody had their own separate, go back 12 years, they're all doing their own thing. And yet 100 agencies are somehow working off the same page. You organized them somehow.
Yeah, and I think that's key. Once again, it's about maximizing impact by coming together and collectively working together.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily require more money initially. It just requires for folks to align their resources, their day-to-day activities, and their investments together to really have an impact on getting folks out of shelters and off the streets.
Right. And just kind of relating to you in City Hall, you're in City Hall,
Yep.
You're in the mayor's office, but maybe you could just talk briefly, and I think it's important, organizationally, how are you placed within City Hall?
Sorry.
Maybe not.
No. I was thinking of the other. Ask me about, I want to make
About
sure
business.
I hit upon business and the
Central
funding side.
structure, all the funding
COC,
sources.
yeah.
All the funding side.
Okay, so,
So-
having organized all
Sorry.
those organizations and getting them marching, the same beat, funding follows that.
Yeah. And what we realized is that we had a lot of funding streams and we were funding a lot, but we were funding everything under the sun and nothing was aligned or strategic. One of the most important things we did, and we learned this from Denver at the time, was that we needed to coalesce all of our purse strings together. And it doesn't mean all the funds go into one agency. It just means there's one agency coming up with the plan and the direction that all the funding aligns with. And so we have an independent lead agency here that works on creating the plan and coordinates the actual investments of dollars. So all the funding coming from the private sector, the funding coming from the city, the funding coming from the county, the funding coming from the federal government to the continuum of care, it is all aligned together on one plan through one agency, kind of as the air traffic controller.
Right.
Not just on the funding, but also on the services and the efforts being done at the end of the day. Internally in Houston, we've empowered our Coalition for the Homeless to be that lead agency to do that. It could be whatever agencies. We didn't feel the need to create a whole new organization or steering committee. We felt we already had one. We just need to empower them. Let's provide them the technical assistance. Let's provide them the whatever they need to do that job effectively and efficiently.
Right. The businesses, obviously they're dramatically affected by homelessness. A lot of it's right downtown where a lot of these businesses are located. How are they coming on board? How are they feeling about these initiatives we're talking about?
Well, I think we talked about this is a community problem. It's a community issue. The government just can't do it alone. Government can't fund it alone. And at the end of the day, everybody needs to come together. And I think whether it was Mayor Parker who started it or whether Mayor Turner who took the system to a new level, both of those elected officials looked at the private sector to come in as partners. And so whether it's the president of the Houston Texans, whether it's Chevron, who paid for my salary to begin with, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, all these private
These are all
sectors
supporters.
came together to really not just fund the program, but to also to look at the numbers, to provide accountability and so forth. Once again, pulling all the purse strings together on one strategic vision to maximize the impact.
Right. So, Mark, if you were to give Spokane a piece of advice, you guys have gotten where you are and we're kind of undertaking this now, what would be the advice you'd give us going forward?
Act smart, act quickly. Don't waste any more time. Every single day, individuals are becoming homeless in Spokane. We cannot sit there and spend months and years devising plans and relationship building. You got to act now. And part of it is building the ship while it's sailing. Okay,
Right.
you know, this is not a perfect situation we're in right now, and it's not going to be a perfect plan. But don't let the good get in the way. Don't let the perfect get in the way of the good.
Right, right.
And so, act now and act quickly, modify as needed, but don't waste any more time because it'll only get worse. And seize the opportunity that's right now. But the public will and the political will is so important.
I think we've got that. I think a recent survey, over 80% of people in Washington think this is the number one issue, and that's going to help us a lot.
Yeah, and I'll say, at first when we were looking at this, people thought, hey, we could just, use law enforcement and get folks into treatment. But what we found is we can't force anybody to go into shelter. And the Constitution, whether you agree with it or not, doesn't allow you just to indiscriminately force folks or arrest folks right into
Back to
treatment
data.
or to keep them
You're
there.
a lawyer, right?
You're right. Yeah. So, it would make my job a lot easier if we could force people to do what we want. But we can't. That's not how society works. And these are human beings at the end of the day. So that's when we look at, okay, what do people actually want to engage in that will keep them off the streets? And once again, for us, it was clear. It was housing with the support services, and that was the magical combination.
Marc, this has been a great conversation. Really appreciate you taking the time. I envision in 5 years, we'll bring you up to Spokane and show you what we've been able to do.
I can't wait, and I'm extremely optimistic. It's exciting what's going on in Spokane, and you guys don't need any luck because you got it in your DNA, so thank you.
Right on. Thank you.